I can start with that. So I think about security in terms of broad capabilities, right? And depending on which framework you might align to, it varies. But what I tend to see is that customers are very good at some, or good at some, and like ignore others that they're just not as versed in, right? And so if you think about their overall security like program, that means that they have like some blind spots, right? So for example, they might be good at identifying their assets, but they're not good at threat detection, right? Or they're not prepared for an incident and how they would respond to that. Or they might be good at protecting assets, getting protections in place, but their backups are weak, right? So if something were to happen, would they be able to restore from backups, right? And so that's one of the things that I always try to do is try to figure out, what are you good at and what do you need help with, and that helps guide the conversation.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I think everybody went into cloud and then thought about incident response afterwards. That's something that I run into a lot is nobody has actually defined what cloud incident response actually looks like. And so there is a lot of talk with my clients around how do we do incident response from cloud or for cloud, and how does it differ from what we've done traditionally, and how do we just put something in place? Do we need a new team? Do we need to upskill the current team? Those kinds of things I think are pretty common now amongst clients.
I think the kind of what you mentioned as far as like what is different now versus what we did before, I think there's still a lot of people that are stuck in before. So I think that there are a lot of companies that I've run into that don't necessarily know what the benefits of cloud actually are, and how to utilize them properly to get that actual like highest benefit. So a lot of people are just kind of stuck and they're like, oh, this isn't as great as I thought it was, but I think it's due to their own mishaps.
Agreed. Yeah, there's kind of a dynamic happening there because some clients they definitely don't know how to use cloud properly, or to its fullest benefit. Let's remove properly and say to its fullest benefit. But then there's also the dynamic that's happening with those that have been in the cloud for a few years now who are starting to go into putting more sensitive data into the cloud. And I think that's a real positive step for us and for the cloud, because that's saying we're reaching the point where things are secure enough and we have the expertise enough so that we're going to put our crown jewels in the cloud. And I think that's been kind of something that a lot of big organizations in particular have refrained from doing.
Absolutely. Coming from a finance background, that's something that was like the biggest sticking point, right? I worked at a bank and there were so many people that were like, let's go to cloud. We want to move. We want to do things, agile and great things and whatever. But the people that were in charge obviously were like, no, absolutely not. And that's kind of another thing that I've seen is that there's not always support from higher up. So having to say what the cloud benefits are and explain that in a business term is something that people really need to, I don't want to say work on, but should definitely focus on.
Definitely.
When organizations do move some significant asset to the cloud, do you see that they use that opportunity to revisit their, threat model and plan around that?
I don't, personally.
I was going to say, I think if they were doing it properly, yes, that would be what they would do and kind of reframe where they're coming from and how they handle things. But I think that it's kind of more of I'm going to lob it over the wall and then figure it out.
That matches my experience as well. And I feel like it's a big missed opportunity.
I agree.
Because a lot of times you can get rid of a lot of what you were doing before if you like update your mental model to the cloud, right? Not just the tooling, but just generally like how are we going to approach this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. And there's that point too where they're trying to take their traditional model, what existed, their frameworks, and they're just trying to push that into cloud. And that goes to your comment as well, is we need to revisit that and figure out what carries forward into cloud, what doesn't carry forward into cloud, what needs to be updated or modified so that it actually makes sense in cloud. But yeah, I totally am in line with what you guys have experienced with your clients as well.
Absolutely. On the flip side of that, I will say that I've run into at least one that has done a really great job, again, in finance, but they have spent a lot of time kind of reworking what they have already in the cloud. They were definitely ahead of their time and are still working to fine tune it and to make things more accessible and more reasonable for cloud usage.
Agreed. And I think that's where, as security experts, we need to go in and we need to be advocates as much as we are engineers and architects and the experts, because I think a lot of these organizations need the expertise to be spoken to at the highest level of the organization so that they understand what needs to change, because without their blessing, nothing moves.
Do you find more friction at the higher levels in an organization or at the lower levels?
I think it depends on the organization.
I agree with that. I would say in my experience, it's mostly been at the higher level because a lot of people don't necessarily understand the value of it. I think a lot of engineers are happy to, build fast, like go and do things and see how it goes. But I think that a lot of the management is a little bit slower on that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like they can be jaded from years of experience where promises didn't, become fulfilled, right? And so yet again, we're promising, the cloud's going to solve all your problems, right?
Yeah.
I mean, no one's promised that.
Well, right,
Nobody
but it's like, yet again, they're like, okay, well, I've done this. I found something that kind of works,
Right.
So that makes sense. I have seen the flip side, though. I've seen senior leadership understand what they want to do, and, engineers say, we don't want to upskill yet again. Like, we've got something working. Stop telling us how to do our jobs.
Yep.
Yeah.
So as you said, they kind of need to be in line.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
agree.
And prior to entering consulting, when I was just working in the financial services industry, and that we did have a lot of individuals especially within the ops and the IT departments, they thought that their jobs were going away.
Yeah.
So they would present barriers to prevent you moving forward with a lot of the things that needed to happen.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think that kind of as the workforce turns over a little bit, right? Like cloud is still relatively new, but I think a lot of younger folks, that's what they learn to build on. And I think that as those younger folks start to move more and more into the workforce and kind of edge out the folks that are used to racks and things like that, it'll be kind of a natural progression towards cloud in general.
I agree. Agreed. Most kids are coming out of college now having built on nothing but the 3 major cloud platforms. And
Sure.
nobody knows email like the Yahoo Mail days like we did, right?
Yeah. But that's also, I think there's opportunities there, right? Like it's easier than ever to learn your craft, right? Like when I was younger, I had to build the home lab and get all the hardware and understand the cables. Like now you can just sign up and get going in 2 minutes, right?
Yep.
So there's kind of no excuse for not learning, your tech.
Definitely.
I agree.
Feels like.
But that also creates a little bit of a threat, right? Because now someone who wants to do the bad things doesn't need to go out and buy a server. They don't need to have all the wiring.
Sure.
They can launch things, and I think that's where a lot of the timidness comes from with moving to cloud in particular. It seems like, well, if I can't have this machine sitting in my back closet with a padlock on it, then that makes me nervous.
Yeah, I think it's what you're used to, right? So you're used to being like, oh, this is my computer, it's mine, I will take care of it. But if it's cloud, people see it as just somebody else's computer, and it's kind of out there in the wild, and you don't really know what it is or where it's at. I think that if you do understand kind of the basics of it, though, it will help you be more okay with it, right? So if you study the security portion of it, there's ways that you can make that just as secure as padlock in the back room. You just have to know what they are.
Exactly. So where do you guys see the trajectory of cloud going with regards to multi-cloud versus a single cloud?
So I think there's not really one cloud that has everything, right? So I don't think it's bad to use multi-cloud in any way, but I do think it's important to know what you're doing in each of those clouds. So for example, if you start with GCP or AWS, before you move on to another one, make sure that you understand the foundations of what it is that you're doing. Don't just try and grab a different cloud to fix whatever your problems were.
I feel like it's important to distinguish between using multiple clouds for distinct purposes and trying to span one application across multiple
Yes.
providers. Spanning one application across multiple providers is probably always a bad idea, right? It means that you are stuck with the lowest common denominator. You don't get to take advantage of those specific cloud features. And I think that if you're doing that because you're hoping to play them against each other to try to get like a pricing advantage, I'm not sure that's really working for anybody. So on the other hand, like people should probably be taking advantage of their cloud, as you said, and to the fullest extent possible for the application where it makes sense.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. And I feel like in some ways this happens organically. Like there's this talking point that says you have to go multi-cloud, avoid lock-in, all of that. But then you have organizations who will, most organizations I've been in have 90% of their workloads in one cloud and then kind of some peripheral stuff happening elsewhere.
But it's probably unavoidable to have footprints in each one.
Agreed.
Right? Whether that's from acquisitions or teams that just specialize in one thing and really don't want to learn something new to do what they're trying to do, they're probably all going to have footprints across the board. And that's one of the things that we're seeing with security is like you might focus all your security on where that 90% is, but then that other 10% is left completely unmonitored.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So I think it makes sense to take a proactive approach to get your baseline security controls in all of the places where you're going to have workloads, and make sure you've got full coverage.
Yeah,
Agreed.
absolutely. I think it's important to have those regardless of what you have in the cloud, right? Make sure that everything is secured, nice before you really get started is the best way to do it. And then make sure that you kind of keep that up as you move along, as things grow. Because that's one of the other things that I've seen significantly is people will start as like a small company and they'll have, this one thing, and like you mentioned, acquisitions and things like that, they'll grow and then they kind of get in over their heads and don't necessarily grow with the cloud at the same pace that their company is growing.
Agreed. Yeah. How modular are the security controls between clouds?
I wouldn't really consider them modular, honestly. One of the trends that I'm seeing is establishing a policy for all clouds, right? Or just generally all places that you're going to host workloads, and then having, supporting policies or specific procedures of like, this is how we're going to apply that here, right? Because that's going to require specific language. I do think that you can think about the same categories, right? And think about all the comprehensive controls that you're going to have, but they're just not the same across the different providers as much as we'd like them to be.
Definitely. You're not going to take an air filter off a Honda and put it on a Chevy, right? In most cases. That's just the way things work. Everybody is different. The baseline operating systems tend to be different. The functionality just tends to be different.
Yeah. And really the threats to each one are going to look different, right? So when you're thinking about threat detection, like what nefarious activity looks like in one place is going to look a little bit different from others. And I do think it makes sense to strive to have, coverage of threats across the attack chain in all of those. But some are going to, require different controls than others, or in different detection methods.
Yep. How does AI play into the threats that we're seeing in cloud currently?
Well, so I think that one of the things that we're going to see is we're going to see a lot more kind of AI-empowered attacks, right? Like, people are making a big effort right now to build like hack bots, right? They use AI to automate a scan against you, take the results of that scan, apply them, in a bunch of different ways, potentially look for novel exploits. I mean, that's probably one of the things that AI is not going to do like automatically. But if they can automate a bunch of the toil of like finding your resources, scanning them, whatever, I think we just might see a larger scale of scanning, and we were already seeing a big amount of scanning and vulnerability like probing, so I think we might see even more.
Certainly. I don't think that AI in its current iteration, I think the attacks that we're seeing are too complex in many ways to be everyday attacks. When we talk about things outside of phishing, but phishing and human engineering have always been low-hanging fruit, right? That's the easiest way through a door. But if you're talking about the technical side of things, I would agree with you. I just don't think that it's had the impact that it's notable for, and and I think it's a wise thing to start preparing for it now. I'm just not sure that it's where we think it is just yet.
Yeah.
I'll take the flip side of this and say that in some situations there's like AI that's being used in kind of like the Sims and things like that we see, and I think that like you said, it's not quite to its full potential yet, but I think that will help cut down on like alert fatigue, and will help get to know your system and your environment and kind of block out those things that aren't necessarily something that you need to worry about.
If I had to think about the biggest risk that AI is posing right now, it's probably more organizations looking to hastily implement some sort of AI,
Yeah.
and then creating vulnerabilities for themselves, right? Like
Yes.
not AI being used against them. So instead they're like, okay, I really need to feed my data into this thing, but I'm not going to consider where is that going or how does it connect to stuff, and just kind of forgetting all the basics along the way. And so it's probably going to be more like an own goal, right, than a stronger attacker for now.
Certainly.
I think that's a big problem, is I think that a lot of people don't necessarily know what is in all of their data or where all of their data is, and so then they just kind of start feeding it everything, and then stuff gets in there that shouldn't be in there, like PII and things like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's actually one of the trends that I'm seeing is companies coming to us and saying, we inherited this environment one way or another, and we don't know what's in it.
Yep.
Right? It wasn't well documented, or it wasn't well like tagged and labeled, and we don't know how this works. Like, how do we secure this? Right? And so that's one of the things that we're helping people do is like discover what do you have and think through all the security implications. And maybe that team did a great job of setting it up, but you don't know, right? Or maybe they didn't, and there's like missing pieces. But the inheriting team like doesn't have the skills, right? And they've lost all the knowledge of how that came to be.
Certainly.
I think this brings up a really interesting thing that is not usually something that people consider security, but like documentation. Document what is in your systems, document all of the things around it, so that when you do go through an acquisition or you hand it over to someone else, that you're aware of what's there.
Yeah, and maybe that's something that the generative AI movement can help close, right, is the documentation loophole, because you're right, that's something that every organization has struggled with. Every organization I've ever been in, whether I'm consulting or in the organization, they struggle with technical documentation. And the next team comes in 10 years later, opens that up, and they have terrible comments in their code, and things don't make sense, and then you have another security problem on your hands.
Right.